The problem I wish to discuss in these lectures is the nature of autobiographical writing by Jews over the centuries, and specifically, the ways in which such writings can legitimately be used as sources for Jewish history. My interest in this problem emerged while I was writing my last book on Zionism and the fin de siècle, and discovered that one of my most important sources, Vladimir Jabotinsky's wonderful and indeed stirring autobiography entitled in its original Hebrew Sipur Yamai, that is the story of my life, was all but invented out of whole cloth. That is, it contradicted the massive data in black and white in Russian, Hebrew, German, Yiddish, and Italian that I had gathered on 3 continents by and about Jabotinsky on matters both small and grand. In due course, I realized that far more interesting than debunking Jabotinsky's own retelling of the events of his life was deciphering the ways in which he had retroactively created his own mythologized and to some extent mythological life story, constructing a supremely controlled and controlling narrative in which truth-telling necessarily gave way to the overall purposes and goals of the book. That is a brilliant but highly fictionized self-fashioning. To sort out this matter, I began to read literary theory on autobiography, and I discovered that I had but hit upon something entirely well known. That in the last 50 years, an immense body of academic analysis of autobiography has appeared, written largely by literary scholars and critics, questioning the very nature of autobiographical writing, its definitions, boundaries, and relationship to what we normally designate as the truth. Now, these studies have queried not only the very nature of autobiographical writings, its definition, the boundaries and relationship of autobiography to what we normally designate as the truth. These studies have also distinguished autobiographies from allied genres, from memoirs, autobiographical fiction, and the like, and have asked to what extent every autobiographer plays fast and loose with the truth. Not simply that all autobiographies contain errors of fact. These one important critic felicitously called mere friendly difficulties compared with those that belong to the very nature of autobiography. That is, both the conscious and the far more elusive unconscious distortions of memory and narrative selection that in many ways define the very act of choosing to write one's own life story. Countless positions have been taken on the definition of autobiography as a genre and its relationship to other forms of narrative, the latter itself having become an increasingly complex subject of theoretical musing, as of course have the mechanisms, both psychic and physiological, by which we remember things and forget them. Indeed, although literary theory and hard scientific research are often at war with each other, philosophically speaking, in the realm of memory research, there is a fascinating and surprisingly little reflected upon confluence between the two, since the most recent scientific breakthroughs in discovering how the brain works more or less parallel the conclusions of the literary critics about how important autobiographers are in constructing their own memories. Suffice it here to say that contemporary neuroscientists' understanding of memory as reconstructive and influenced by context and by motivation supports the literary theorist's emphasis on the active role of the autobiographer in the construction of his or her past. As a result, not only has the genre of autobiography and the degree of reliability of the contents of countless autobiographies been minutely dissected and deconstructed, the very building blocks of autobiography, what and how an author remembers and how he or she chooses to relate those memories in narrative form, have been called into question in fundamental ways that simply do not permit us any longer to look at autobiographies as unproblematically reliable first-person accounts of lives lived and stories told. To some extent, of course, pondering the extent to which autobiographical writings are fictional or semi-fictional constructions of selves does serve to derail the possibility of our telling the story of an individual life or of a culture as a whole. As with so many other corollaries of self-consciousness, what we gain in precision, we all but give up in the loss of narrative coherence. But this does not, to my mind, efface the possibility of an accurate depiction of the past, or of a philosophical stance that distinguishes neutrally between fact and fiction. On the question of truth-telling, I am far from a denier of the very possibility of objective truth, believing that truth is in fact obtainable if elusive, that it exists as a philosophical goal if not a pre-existing reality, and that truth is discernible to us if remarkably difficult to ascertain through hard work and a close, self-conscious study of reality, whether past or present. And my goal in these lectures, and in the book that will follow, is not to provide even a capsule history of Jewish autobiographies over the centuries, but to subject a small number of autobiographies written by Jews to two of the central questions posed by the first major American critic on autobiography, Roy Pascal, 40 years ago, and refined and reformulated by other critics over the intervening decades. First, what is the design of the autobiography or the life story at hand? And secondly, what is the relationship of this autobiography to historical truth? That is, historical truth without quotation marks. Now, on the second question, I take as my starting point the assumption that every author that I will analyze has constructed a version of his or her life meant from the start not to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, but a story of her or his life that conforms with the author's sense of self, refracted through the peculiar dynamics of writing one's own life story. In the event, conscious processes, such as the selection of which material to include and which material to omit, combine with the largely unconscious and still, despite the advances of neuroscience, basically still mysterious chemical dynamics of remembering and forgetting, that these combine to yield a narrative that is, by definition, factually problematic. The challenge to the historian, as opposed to the literary critic or the psychologist, is to decide how to use such inherently problematic texts as historical sources. What can we responsibly learn from such sources, inherently problematic sources, about the lives they open up and the lives they share with us, the time or place they depict, the societies they so eloquently describe? My challenge here, moreover, was to decide which autobiographies to subject to these questions. Over the last 5 years, I have read, at times at the madly obsessive rate of one per day, several hundred autobiographies and memoirs written by Jews in Hebrew, Yiddish, Russian, French, German, and even in English, and found dozens that I thought merited a detailed analysis. But in these lectures, I have limited myself to a mere handful of such texts, and I make no claim that those I discuss are representative either of Jewish autobiographies or of autobiographical Jews throughout the centuries. My primary principle of selection was that the text I discuss be of compelling interest, first to me and then I hope to my audience, because like most readers of autobiographies, I too want, first of all, to read a good story, to learn about a fascinating life, even as we analyze and decode the complex relationship of these stories to the more mundane world of factual truth. Before coming to the two texts I want to discuss this evening, I must very briefly explain that we have very, very few autobiographies written by Jews until the 17th century. In the book that will, I hope, result from these lectures, I'll analyze the very first Jewish autobiography, written by the great first-century Jewish historian Josephus, not usually included in any of our studies of Jewish autobiography. Then after Josephus, again in the first century, we have to skip about 1,000 years to a brief autobiographical account written by a medieval French Jew, and then almost another half millennium to the sudden appearance of autobiographical writings by Jews during the Renaissance. Several scholars have pondered the reason for this long absence of autobiographies written by Jews, and have theorized that this is so since in the Jewish community, as opposed to the Christian world, the individual was subordinated to the community to the extent that the details of an individual life were deemed not suitable to be recorded. That the goal of each Jew's life was to serve God through his Torah and commandments, not to ponder one's own individuality or the mundane details of one's temporal existence. I don't for a minute accept these explanations, which I think confuse the prescriptions of a tiny elite of Jews usually studied by Jewish historians for the experience of millions upon millions of ordinary, normal human beings, both male and female, over the centuries, whose inner lives, aspirations, and obsessions we know virtually nothing about. Moreover, there is abundant evidence of intense autobiographical examination and self-presentation in works as diverse as Ethical Wills, introductions to legal and homiletic texts, and perhaps most importantly, in Hebrew, Yiddish, and other poetry and prose written both for liturgical and for what we would call secular expression. It's rather that the self-standing form, the self-standing genre of autobiographies either remained foreign to Jews throughout the Middle Ages, or, as I suspect but can't prove, that these were indeed written but not preserved, given the fact that the official high culture of Rabbinic Judaism deemed such writings not important. When the scientific study of Jewish history began in the 19th century, scholars began to look for such texts, and they located an interesting number of autobiographies written by Jews during the Renaissance. And they therefore speculated that this sudden appearance of autobiographical writing by Jews must have had something to do with the efflorescence of autobiographical writing by Christians in Europe during this period, as a result of the new emphasis on the self, and hence on what we call self-fashioning in Renaissance thought. The Yiddish proverb says, "Wie es kistelt sich, so yiddelt sich," which I always translate, whatever happens in the Christian world happens in the Jewish world, if with a time delay. But the dynamics of this sort of cultural transmission are always far more subtle than usually asserted. And therefore, I have deliberately chosen for tonight two texts that come not from Italy, where the influence from Renaissance culture to the Jews have been well charted, if often exaggerated, but from the heartland of Rabbinic Judaism in these centuries, Ashkenaz, or in this case, more specifically, the Rhineland, where the possible influence on the Jews of Renaissance humanism is all but impossible to imagine, much less to chronicle. First, a text never before the subject of sustained scholarly study, the mid-17th century Hebrew Book of Memories, in Hebrew the Sefer Zichronot, by the otherwise unknown Asher of Rechshofen, and the far better known, if I think often misrepresented, early 18th century Yiddish memoirs, or Zichronis, by the woman we call Giliki of Hameln. What is crucial to understand from the start about these two figures is that although they were part of the normally voiceless majority, the silent majority of Jews, previously unstudied by historians, they were not to any extent dissenters from the religion of their rabbis, as the famous historian Natalie Zeman-Davis has recently argued in regard to Giliki. On the contrary, both Giliki and Asher were pious Jews, deeply committed to their faith, never for once doubting its eternal veracity and its requirement that they live entirely bounded and defined by the norms, laws, and strictures of Rabbinic Judaism. Indeed, one of the shared central themes of these two autobiographies is precisely their personal, intimate failings in living up to these norms, their struggles with desire and lust, with pride and envy, bereavement and loss. For some reason, on some level profoundly unknowable to us, these two devout and yet all too human Jews decided to put pen to paper to record their lives for posterity. How did they do so? And how, given all we know now about autobiographies and the vagaries of individual memory, can we use their autobiographies as sources for history? The story of how Asher ben Eliezer Halevi of Reichshofen's Sefer Zichronot, or Book of Memories, was preserved is, to say the least, bizarre. It was found in the late 19th century by Eli Scheid, a late 19th century historian of Alsatian Jewry, found the manuscript in one of the antiquarian bookshops on the banks of the Seine in Paris. He gave the manuscript to another Jewish scholar, Moses Ginsberger, who published the text of this manuscript with a German censored translation in 1912. The manuscript was bound together with a parchment page of a Latin New Testament text and with an expert from Erasmus. Now, the contents of these pages that it was bound along with give us a fascinating hint, I think, about who cobbled together this strange collection. The New Testament text is 1 Corinthians 9-13. I wrote you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people. In no way did I mean the immoral of this world, or the greedy and swindlers and idolaters, since you would then have to go out of the world. But now I am writing to you not to associate with anyone who bears the name of brother and sister who is sexually immoral, or greedy, or an idolater, or verbally abusive, or a drunkard, or a swindler. Do not even eat with such a person. For what do I have to do with judging those outside? Are you not to judge those inside? But God will judge those outside. Drive out the evil person from among you. Now, the Erasmus text is equally compelling. These pages were part of his Convivium Profanum, that is, the profound feast, in which Erasmus discovers, among other things, the benefits of abstinence and fasting. And along the way, he has one of his characters, appropriately named Christian, say, in many matters, it's not the fact but the intention that distinguishes us from the Jews. They abstain from certain foods as if from unclean things that would defile the mind. We, though we know that to the pure all things are pure, a quotation from Paul, necessarily deny nourishment to the lustful flesh as if to an unruly steed, so as to render it more obedient to the Spirit. Sometimes we discipline our excessive use of delicacies by the vexation of abstinence. My hypothesis, then, is that this autobiographical manuscript may well have been preserved by a Christian Hebraist, maybe even a convert from Judaism, who was preparing an attack on Jewish vices, including alcoholism and sexual desire or sexual lust, two of the sins Asher confesses to in his autobiography. Be that as it may, Asher's confessions of these and other vices are, I think, essential to his text, if not his only raison d'etre. That, he tells us in the opening words of the autobiography, is to turn my thoughts to and to set in memory the events and experiences that affected me and my family from the day that God brought me forth from darkness to light into the travails of this lowly world. May it come to pass, he writes, that the day of my death be the same as the day of my birth, without sin and cleansed of all iniquity. Therefore I have taken upon myself to engrave with an iron pen the memory of everything that happened to me, good and bad, in order to praise and to give thanks for it all. Just as we bless the good, so we must bless the bad. And I have added to the end of this book everything that happened to my children. And I shall testify to all, both firsthand and with the names of other witnesses to these events, as required by the law. And I've appended as well a chronology of all that happened in my day to the people of Israel. And I shall start from the day of my birth, Friday, the 3rd day of the month of Elul, 1358, which corresponds to the 4th of September, 1598. Thus, Asher's purpose is at once self-referential and historicist, and both in ways that run counter to all our expectations about traditional 16th century Jews. Unfortunately, his second volume, the one on history, has not been preserved, but from the frequent cross-references to this book in the autobiography proper, we can be sure that it included detailed explications of the battles of the 30 Years' War, accounts of the expulsions and persecution suffered by European Jews in the early 17th century, information about rabbis in the major communities of Ashkenazic Jews, their major works and years of death, and perhaps most intriguingly, precise descriptions of the economic history of the Rhineland in these decades, all issues that are interwoven throughout the autobiography, as well as a large number of poetic elegies in typically cumbersome early modern Hebrew rabbinic verse. But Asher's Hebrew prose, on the other hand, is crisp, clear, almost entirely grammatical, a true rarity in his day, and virtually devoid of the Aramaicisms and allusions to Talmudic dicta that were and still are the mark of the educated rabbinic elite and render rabbinic prose so unfathomable to outsiders, including native Hebrew speakers today. Thus, his prose style seems to accord with the person and the curriculum vitae it records. He was born, he tells us, in a small town in Alsace in 1598. At the age of 6, was taught to read Hebrew at home by his father, and then was sent to a school or two until at the age of 12 he began to study the Talmud along with the commentaries. 2 years later, he set off to Prague to study with the great rabbis of that metropolis, and he remained there intermittently until he reached the age of 17, when he moved on to another Talmudic academy where he was awarded the pre-rabbinic title of Bachur, and he learned the laws of kosher slaughtering. After visiting Vienna and Frankfurt am Main, he returned to Alsace and headed for the nearby yeshiva in Metz, where he studied and was certified as a ritual slaughterer. He then served as a teacher in several small nearby towns, until at the age of 24, he married Malka, the 15-year-old daughter of a middling merchant in the village of Rechshofen, where the new couple established their home, soon had 2 children, and tried to make ends meet by dealing, as noted above, as he notes, in wine, wheat, and other agricultural produce. Now, all of this is recorded in astonishingly precise detail. Every significant event in his life is dated by his age at the time, including day, week, and month. If one were so inclined, one could study the weather patterns, the commodity markets, and the cycle of communicative diseases in early 17th century Alsace and Lorraine through Asher's detailed listing of rain and snowfall, the rising and falling prices of grapes and grain, the steady outbreak of the plague. Given the obscurity of much of this data, it's difficult, if not impossible, to assess its degree of accuracy. It's striking to me that his notations about the battles that overwhelmed Alsace-Lorraine in the 30 Years' War are all precisely on target. And for this and other reasons, it's a true shame that his second, more self-consciously historical volume is not extant. Listen to the following extract, late in the book, when the invading Swedish army faces the forces of the Holy Roman Emperor. And we are given both a precise chronology of the battles that ensued and an insight into the behavior of the Jews in the midst of the battle. At that time, there was war and great suffering in this region and land, and because of my fear already in the late summer of 1632, I sent my children and wife and almost everything I owned to the village of Oberborn. But after 3 days, I myself returned home. The Swedes arrived on Sunday, the 28th of October, and besieged the town. Thank God they were roundly defeated, since the townsmen pursued them and attacked them. And on Wednesday, the 31st of October, I returned to my home and prayed to the Redeemer to save me, my family, and my brethren. For the siege of Hagenau, see part 2, where you will find a detailed description of what happened there on Tuesday, the 23rd of October, 1632, when the Swedish forces arrived there, and then the Emperor's army came in stealthily and captured it on Sunday, the 15th of January. At that time, he continues, there were billeted here in Rechshofen 100 cavalrymen from the Emperor's army, and they captured 2 important Swedish officers who then sent me to Metz to arrange for their ransoming. On Tuesday, the 3rd of May, 1633, I arrived there with great difficulty and in much danger. But by the by, I bought a good deal of merchandise, and out of fear, I went home in a roundabout way. When I arrived on Wednesday, the 11th of May, past Püttlingen, near the village of Reich, 5 cruel imperial soldiers attacked me and stole from me everything that I had. Thank God the messenger who had my merchandise got away, and I wasn't physically attacked. Thank the Lord who protects the faithful. But what is most intriguing about this autobiography is not such fascinating episodes, but the continuous and gripping pathos of Asher's struggles with himself, his attempt to use the literary device of autobiography, so seemingly foreign to his culture and his training, to record and confront his failings and thus to become a better human being. His most often recorded sins, as my hypothesized Christian Hebraeus preserver of his manuscript well knew, were drinking, gambling, and sexual desire. He repeatedly records taking vows to stay away from the taverns in which low-life Jews and non-Jews cavort together, drinking and gambling, and seems to have been most addicted to the games of dice and cards, in which he regularly lost substantial amounts of money, and which he feared would bring disgrace to his name and to his family. As a pious Jew, he knew that vows taken so solemnly could not be broken. As a somewhat learned Jew, he pored through the rabbinic codes to find legal ways to nullify these vows, only to renew them again and again when he strayed back to the gambling dens he found so appallingly irresistible. Similarly, he vowed to abstain from non-kosher wine, which he reports was imbibed by Jews of all types throughout his region, despite the rabbinic prohibition, a reality we know well from other sources. But nowhere else do we get a comparable description of how an ordinary Jew designed his house to keep him more devout. He writes, "The house that I built and bought with God's help and dedicated to his glory and his Torah included three things. First, a small room for regular prayer and study of Torah, and to house my sacred books, which I shall list later on, and unfortunately this part of the memoir is missing. Second, a small oven to bake matzah for Passover and challah for the Sabbath and to warm the cholent for the Sabbath day. Third, a small bathhouse behind the stove for several reasons, and most importantly because there's a bestial custom in these parts, that the Gentiles bathe together with their wives in one bathhouse, and the Jews and their wives do the same thing, mixing with the Gentiles and their wives. And I fought for the honor of the Lord and built myself a special room in my house to bathe in on Sabbath eves. In the event I need bloodletting, because bloodletting was done in bathhouses so the blood could drip, and for my wife's ritual purification." Now this is immediately following by a recording of another incident, or an incident about another form of ritual impurity that might embarrass my audience, but speaks volumes about the nature and setting of this text and the life it describes. We know from multiple scholarly studies the notions of sexuality, privacy, and what is appropriate to discuss in the public realm were far different in the early 17th century than in the early 21st century. Thus Asher writes, "Here in Rechshofen there gathered together a minion of neighbors for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and I served without compensation as their prayer leader, standing on my feet all of Kol Nidre Eve and the entire day of Yom Kippur. But God caused me to have a nocturnal ejaculation on the night of Kol Nidre, and I was not unaware of the Talmudic discussion on these matters, which would prohibit me from leading the services the next day. Now this happened between 1 and 2 in the morning, and I rose from my bed and went to my wife's room, and I tearfully told her what had happened. We both cried, and I resolved to immerse myself in a ritual bath before sunrise, since I was the only cantor in these parts. I checked the legal codes to see whether 9 cubits of water were sufficient for immersions after nocturnal ejaculations. And in my research, I discovered that immersion was not in fact required in a case such as this, that simply cleaning up was sufficient, since the quantity was so small. So I immediately rose from my sleep and calmed down, and I put my trust in God and implored him to have mercy on me, on account of my forefathers and my little children, since of course he regarded this as punishment from God. And I pledged to search through my misdeeds and commit myself anew to his service, and he, the Creator, will do what is just in his eyes. Thus signed, Asher Halevi." And poor Asher, the very same thing happened to him again 2 years later on Kol Nidre night, which he recorded again with a broken heart in the midst of one of the worst battles of the 30 Years' War. Now, from the wording of these paragraphs, we see that, like a good part of the autobiography as a whole, they were originally composed as diary entries, inscribed soon after they happened. Then, at some later point, they were redacted to adhere to a more linear and coherently retrospective narrative. Now, this procedure is crucial to our understanding of Asher's autobiography as a whole. What began as an intimate confessional diary meant to record one man's sins in order to goad himself into self-improvement, was later revisited and redrafted by this same man for far different and frankly literary purposes. In other words, his self-study was gradually transmuted into self-conscious self-fashioning, an autobiographical narrative that tried to make sense of his life and times, first for himself and then in some way for us, though we cannot know whether and in what ways Asher expected his words to be read by anyone else. In a paradoxical way, then, Asher's very ignorance of the seemingly Gentile genre of autobiography led him to pen an autobiography that was essentially unmediated by the screens and the artifices of that form, and hence in many ways was more directly reflective of his lived experiences than other, more stylized accounts. But this still does not mean that we can be as delightfully naive as he was, and blithely use this autobiography as a source for the social history of early modern Jews, confidently generalizing from its anecdotes facts about Christian-Jewish relations, Jewish marital and dowry customs, learning patterns, and the like. Given what we know about the nature of memory, here undoubtedly intertwined with the confessional purposes of the recollections, I, for one, would abstain from generalizing from the specifics of Asher's life, of his life writing, to his society as a whole, until and unless we find many more contemporaneous documents that allow us to check his reconstructions against independent evidentiary sources. But this in no way diminishes the historical importance of Asher's Sefer Zichronot, whose abiding power consists not in what he shared with his fellow 17th century Jews, but in what was singular and remarkable about him. The first ordinary Jew we know of, learned but not a rabbi, small-town Ashkenazic as opposed to worldly Italian, who wrote his autobiography in the heyday of, but apparently oblivious to, the renewed Renaissance self-consciousness about individual identity. At the same time, though, Asher was entirely devoted to the religion of the rabbis and the collective structures and myths of rabbinic Judaism. But he did not believe that the precise recording of the details of his life story, even his intimate life story, was irrelevant because of those myths and structures. On the contrary, he conceived of his life as a highly individuated struggle for self-betterment, in which self-awareness and a literarily self-conscious manipulation of that self-awareness were crucial. In this, I don't for a minute believe that he was alone among pre-modern Jews, despite the paucity of literary evidence of parallel constructions of self. Asher's autobiography ends in the winter of 1634-1635, when around Hanukkah time the frost was so severe that he and his friends feared that the Rhine would freeze over and the emperor's troops would cross over and reinvade Alsace. But he tells us in his typically precise way, the rains came and the ice melted, and then another frost began on the 16th of January, 1635. Here the chronicle of his and his family life comes to an end. And Asher's last literary act is appropriately devotional, a genealogical record of the births, marriages, and deaths of his extended family members for several generations before him. Thus Asher's fate and the fate of his wife, daughter, and son after those cold January days of 1635 remain unrecorded and unknown to us. But we do know a great deal about the later history of one branch of his extended family that he mentions in his genealogical account, the wealthy Levi family of Metz, into which none other than Giliki of Hameln married in 1700 at the age of 54. At this point, Giliki had probably written a good chunk of the first draft of her own autobiography, the final version of which was preserved by her family for generations after her own death in 1724, first published in its original Yiddish 172 years later in 1896 by the renowned scholar David Kaufman. It was Kaufman who dubbed her Giliki of Hameln, a designation she had never borne in her lifetime, though her first husband was oft referred to as Chaim Hamelin after the town of his birth. We don't know what she called herself, or for that matter her autobiography, since the original manuscript of the autobiography has never been located. The only manuscript we have is a copy made by one of her sons after her death. The loss of the original manuscript is a terrible shame, since it prevents us from seeing, possibly quite literally, how the book was composed. Glickel tells us that she began writing it in 1690 after the death of her first husband and continued working on it until 1719, periodically going over and correcting her text. But it would be immensely useful for our purposes to see exactly how this editorial process proceeded, how much and to what extent she revised her words and her memories over these 3 decades of composition. The original text is very different in almost every respect from the terrible and unreliable English edition that many of you may be familiar with. That is Marvin Lowenthal's The Memoirs of Giliki of Hameln, which is still a bestseller. Lowenthal translated Glickel's words not from the Yiddish original, but from a terrible 1913 German translation, which itself left out huge sections of Glickel's work. Lowenthal then made matters even worse by rearranging the orders of Glickel's chapters, expurgating additional sections of the text, and rendering it into an artificially archaic and pedantic English that in no way conveys to the reader Glickel's style, her tone, and to some extent her worldview. That worldview, moreover, has for understandable reasons often been hitched to ideological causes as foreign to Glickel as the 21st century is to the late 17th and early 18th centuries, presenting her as a Yiddishist or a feminist avant la lettre, or as I have already mentioned, as one who argued with God or questioned basic Jewish religious law. But my purpose here is not to quarrel with these versions of Glickel, but to pose the same questions to her text that I did to Asher's and to the other ones which I will be describing. What is the design of the work? What purposes did it serve for its author? What is the level of facticity in the text? And then most importantly for me, how and in what ways can we continue to use it as a historical source? To answer the first question, one must first assess Glickel's writing style, which, like so many other aspects of her life and work, have been rather romanticized in the literature. First and foremost, we are dealing here with a very, very long text, 330 printed pages in the Kaufman edition, divided by Glickel herself into 7 books, which vary from 22 to 80 printed pages. But each of these books has no paragraph markers or even breaks between sentences. Each book, therefore, reads like one long, often excruciatingly long sentence. Although here and there commas appear between some clauses, the reader is essentially forced to punctuate the text on her or his own, a challenge made even more difficult by Glickel's habit of interspersing throughout her narrative long folk stories taken from a variety of sources. The result is an extraordinarily difficult and dense text to read, and one is hard-pressed to imagine anyone but a scholar of Jewish autobiography or 17th century Jewish history or the Yiddish language actually sitting down and doing so. Though often Glickel has been presented to us as an ordinary woman, she was in fact extremely non-ordinary in socioeconomic terms. Her father, she tells us, was the second richest Jew in Hamburg in his day, paying the largest dowry ever known in the community to the husband of one of her sisters. More reliably, the extant tax records of Hamburg-Altona revealed that her husband was the 4th richest Jewish householder in that community in the next generation. And Glickel and Chaim arranged matches for their children with even wealthier members of this tiny Jewish mercantile elite. Their eldest son married a daughter of the 3rd richest Jew of Hamburg. Their younger son married a daughter of by far the richest Jew in the community. And their oldest daughter married a son of the richest Jew of nearby Cleve, who was said to be worth 100,000 Reichsdaler, an immense fortune at the time. And when Glickel left Hamburg to marry Serf Levi in Metz, her socioeconomic status rose even further, as the court, Jew-like, French-speaking Levi family were far wealthier and more politically connected than any of the Jews in Hamburg-Altona at this time. Her autobiography is filled then with detailed and fascinating descriptions of the extensive business dealings she was engaged in, both during and after her first marriage, the protracted negotiations concerning the marriages of her children, and all the events and circumstances that surrounded and conditioned these intersecting and intertwined commercial and domestic affairs. To what extent this highly atypical woman can be said to be representative of anything, I shall address soon. Before then, I want to ponder more closely the connection between this anticipated rise in economic and social status attendant upon her second marriage and what that critic Roy Pascal called the design of the autobiography itself. Glickel tells us in the very opening of the book that she began to write her memoirs as a result of the depression she suffered upon the death of her first husband, whom she loved dearly. Although this claim, like everything else Glickel wrote, has been taken as unproblematically accurate by all other commentators on this text, I propose that we must be exceedingly careful before we take her words as factual. First, since her words here have been mistranslated into the present tense by all the previous translations. But what she actually wrote, or as it has been previously translated as I am writing this book after the death of my first husband. But in fact, her actual words in 17th century Yiddish did not say that. An accurate rendering demonstrates that these sentences and most of the text as a whole were written by Glickel not at the time of their action or soon thereafter, but retrospectively. More important, in between these two passages come two long pages which have been entirely omitted in all the other translations, but are crucial to an understanding of what I take to be Glickel's fundamental motivation in composing this autobiography as a whole. These passages begin with what seems to be simply a conventional homily on God's mercy. We are taught in Hebrew, she writes, Kol ma shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo bara ela lichvodo v'ha'olam b'chesed yivneh. Everything that God created, he did so for his honor, and the world was created in mercy. This means, she writes, we know that God created and did everything out of great righteousness and mercy. For he has no need of any of his creatures, but he created them all for his honor and in righteousness and mercy, and for the benefit of us sinful people. For everything he created has utility for us humans, even if we cannot discern how this is so. But Glickel's thoughts soon turned to a meditation on the fundamental problem of theodicy. That is, how and why does God permit evil to exist, and why evil people thrive while the righteous suffer. First, she gives the conventional rabbinic answer that this life is short and true reckoning comes only after death. But this does not totally satisfy her, and so she continues, the poor man who has lived all his days in pain and suffering dies peacefully, for death is what he prayed for all his life, since he actually died a little bit every day, but had constant faith that God would reward him with a better life in the hereafter. But the evil rich man who lives happily and with much money and seeks nothing other than what is good, and he and his children have only the best, nothing bothers them at all. When the time comes for him to depart from this world and he knows what and how much he is leaving, in his last thought, he ponders how much God has rewarded him with, how he has to abandon all his riches and power, and he has to give a reckoning to God about how he handled himself in this world. This journey is much harder for him than for the poor man. I need not say more. These words make little or no sense in the context of the immediate aftermath of Chaim's death, her first husband's death, since Glickel repeatedly stressed only what a wonderful and righteous man he was. But they make eminent sense if they were composed in the aftermath of the death of her second husband, Serf Levi, who lured her to Metz with promises of great wealth and honor, all of which came to naught when, almost immediately thereafter, he lost his fortune through bankruptcy, and his family as a whole was disgraced in the greatest scandal to befall Metz Jewry in the early 18th century, the arrest and imprisonment for financial chicanery of Samuel Levi, her husband's son, and formerly chief rabbi of Alsace, and more recently, chief financial officer to the Duke of Lorraine. After Levi's death in 1712, Glickel was for the first time in her life reduced to utter poverty, forced to live in one room with her maidservant, and then to move into her daughter's home and become entirely dependent upon her children for her sustenance. The proud, previously independent businesswoman who was raised in wealth and honor, who for decades had been an equal partner with her first husband in a thriving commercial enterprise, and after his death carried on the business with great success, trading alone in the main mercantile markets of Northern Europe, was now a shamed, poor widow, unable to live the life she was accustomed to from birth. My hypothesis, then, is that although Glickel may well have begun the autobiography after the death of her first husband in order to banish depression, to lift her spirits, the version we actually have before us was, from its first page to its last, edited and redrafted with far different emotions at its core. Bitterness, guilt. She confesses that she married her second husband out of a combination of lust and greed. Anger. For understandable reasons, the late 19th and early 20th century translators of her words into German, English, or Hebrew felt it necessary to omit many passages that express these emotions, or to downplay others by under-translation. Since we now know, moreover, that emotions at the time of the retrieval of memories has a defining, indeed a biochemical effect on the nature and content of these memories, we can't for a moment assume that her retroactively recorded memories were either truthful or untouched by what neuroscientists call retroactive bias. To be sure, this is so, even if my hypothesis about the precise time of the composition of her memoirs is incorrect. Under any circumstances, we must consider Glickel's recording of her life story as a constructive literary act of self-representation, rather than a reliable, factual account of what she experienced. This leads to my second hypothesis about this autobiography, that it is not only a literary self-representation, but essentially a self-justification, an attempt to detail for her children how she spent her whole life dedicated to their father and to them, suffering for their benefit and through them. Even her second marriage was effected, she insistently and repeatedly claims, so that she could secure her future and her children's, and especially not have to be dependent upon her children in her old age. This turned out to be a tragic mistake, she conceded. She should have focused on marrying off her youngest daughter rather than herself, and then moved to the land of Israel, where she could have lived out her last years as a pious Jew. Instead, she succumbed to lust and to greed, and God has punished her accordingly. But again, Glickel never expresses anger at God for this punishment. On the contrary, she insists time and time again, he treats his creatures fairly. She's angry at herself, her own sins, her own shortcomings that led her astray, and into the clutches of this evil rich man who promised her even greater wealth and honor than she ever had, but died a death worse than any pauper's. For the most part, Glickel tries not to appear vengeful in her account of her life with Serf Levi. But in one particularly poignant passage, describing none other than their wedding and its immediate aftermath, her wrath at Levi seeps through. The wedding took place on Thursday, the first of the month of Tammuz 5460, which is the 18th of June, 1700. In the morning, I was taken from my daughter's house to my husband's neighboring home, where I stayed till after midnight, when my husband betrothed me with an expensive wedding ring weighing an ounce. I was led under the canopy, and I was brought to our handsomely furnished room near the office, and was served especially prepared wedding foods, as is the custom throughout our area. Though I had fasted all day long, I couldn't eat, since my heart was so heavy. I had wept so many tears with my daughter Esther, as befit our mood that day. My husband then took me into his office and showed me a large box filled to the brim with bracelets and rings, but neither then nor ever after did he give me even one gold or silver ring, and so I was hardly the cause of his later financial ruin. Then in a Gothic scene, virtually foreshadowing Daphne du Maurier or Alfred Hitchcock's Rebecca, arriving in Manderley, Glickel describes being all but trapped in a luxurious home presided over by an evil Mrs. Danforth-like housekeeper, who excluded her from management of her own house and insisted on running the show as she had under her previous mistress. Worse, Serf Levi's children constantly complained of how Germanically frugal Glickel was compared to the lavish French ways of their dearly departed mother. And they laughed in her face when she sent gifts and special fruits over to their homes, remarking at how measly they were in comparison with those their mother had lavished upon them. No wonder then that Glickel ended the passage with the remark, "I put up with such things for a long time, but nonetheless thank God, thinking that my long, sad widowhood had not been in vain, even if it was, as the psalmist put it, joy mixed with fear and trembling." As I hope these passages make clear, what began as a self-justification became a decidedly literary self-fashioning. As already noted, it was Glickel herself who decided to divide her autobiography into 7 books, and she self-consciously extended some of the stories to even out the length of the shorter books. She quite obviously delighted in retelling tales of yore that she had heard or read, molding their plots to fit into her own life story. Given the length of the autobiography and the massive amount of detail it includes, it's not surprising that the chronology is often out of sync. And she, like so many autobiographers before and since, continually records conversations verbatim that she could not possibly have overheard. But on the whole, Glickel's autobiography is a moving and yet supremely controlled narrative in which the author is fully conscious of how to manipulate the telling of her own tale and how she wants her children and us, her readers, to regard and remember her. Thus, the facticity of her account, to the extent to which it's factual, which was hitherto taken for granted, and therefore not seriously addressed in the scholarship, is almost besides the point. And so to end where we began, Glickel's life, like Asher's, for all their self-conscious individualities, were lived entirely within the culture and religious faith of Rabbinic Judaism in its early modern Northern European mode. The world they confronted was, of course, neither static nor in reality easily circumscribed by the wisdom of the ancient, or for that matter, contemporary sages. But male or female, rich or poor, Asher and Glickel, for all their sufferings and travails, never expressed any doubt whatsoever in the justice and mercy of the God in whom they trusted or in his words and commandments. But such doubts would indeed arise and would be expressed within less than half a century after Glickel's death in the very heart of her society, in the heart of Ashkenazic Jewry. And as we shall see in the next lecture, such doubts and rebellion against the tradition would dominate Jewish autobiographical literature for the centuries to come. Thank you very much.